What would you do if someone grabbed your child in broad daylight and cut off a part of them, the part that made them feel safe, the part that made them feel like themselves? It was a warm afternoon, the kind of day where kids should have been playing without a care in the world. My son, Ethan, was out in the neighborhood cul-de-sac with his friends, laughing, kicking around a soccer ball, his long hair flowing freely in the breeze. He was happy, relaxed, lost in the joy of the game. And then she appeared. Karen Dawson. The self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, the woman who ruled our neighborhood like a personal kingdom, the woman who had made it her mission to control everything, and everyone, around her. Karen had always hated Ethan's hair. She made sure we knew it, sneering at him in HOA meetings, dropping passive-aggressive comments when we passed her on the sidewalk. She had once looked my wife in the eye and said, "Boys shouldn't walk around looking like that. It's unnatural." But we ignored her. We had bigger battles to fight than a bitter woman's opinions. Until the day she took matters into her own hands. I don't know what made her snap right then and there. Maybe it was the way Ethan ignored her. Maybe it was the way his hair, the thing she so desperately despised, moved so freely in the wind. Maybe it was the fact that, for once, she wasn't in control. Whatever it was, something in her twisted mind broke, and in that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. No one saw it coming. 1 minute, she was just standing there, watching. The next, she was storming off toward her house. The boys barely noticed. They kept playing, lost in their game, unaware that the woman they all laughed off as a control freak was about to do something unthinkable. They didn't realize she was coming back with something. Something sharp. She reappeared only moments later, moving fast, her breath coming in short, erratic bursts, her hand clenched around a pair of scissors. The boys finally noticed her, their laughter fading, their bodies tensing as an unspoken warning passed between them. "What the hell?" Tyler muttered under his breath. Karen didn't hesitate. She marched straight up to Ethan, her manicured fingers clamping onto his hair before he could even process what was happening. There was no warning. No hesitation. No moment for him to defend himself. She yanked his head back so hard he stumbled, a startled cry ripping from his throat. His hands flew up, grabbing at her wrist, but she was relentless. She twisted her fingers deeper into his hair, and then, with a sickening snap of the scissors, she cut. A thick chunk of Ethan's hair tumbled to the ground. For a second, the world seemed to freeze. The boys stood there, stunned, unable to process what they were witnessing. Ethan gasped, his breath ragged, his fingers scrambling to reach for what had just been stolen from him. And then Karen did it again. Snip. Another section of his hair dropped to the pavement. Ethan screamed. His friends jolted into action, rushing forward, shoving, yelling, trying to stop her. But Karen was wild, frenzied, as if possessed by some kind of madness. Snip. 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 The blades flashed in the afternoon sun, merciless and cold, tearing away the thing that had always brought Ethan comfort. He was sobbing now, gasping, his hands flying up to shield what was left, but she was stronger. She was faster. And no one was stopping her. The neighbors had come out by then. People stood on porches, peeking through windows, watching, whispering, but no one stepped in. Some just shook their heads, some looked away, some crossed their arms as if waiting to see what would happen next. And in the center of it all was Ethan, kneeling on the pavement, tears streaking his face, clutching at the jagged, uneven remains of his once flowing hair. Karen stepped back, finally satisfied with her work. She dropped the last severed strands onto the pavement like discarded trash. "There," she said, her voice smug, self-satisfied. "Now you look like a proper boy." Ethan choked on a sob. His fingers curled around what was left of his hair. His friends stood around him, stunned into silence. Tyler was the first to move. He stepped toward Karen, his fists shaking, his voice barely more than a whisper, but filled with rage. "You psycho." Karen just smirked. She turned on her heel and walked away, heels clicking against the pavement, as if she hadn't just destroyed a part of my son in front of the entire neighborhood. But what she didn't know, what she could have never anticipated, was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because this time, she had messed with the wrong family. And she was about to find out exactly what happens when you cross a line that should never, ever be crossed. I carried Ethan inside, his body trembling against mine, his breath coming in broken sobs as my wife rushed to us. The moment she saw him, saw the uneven patches where his hair had been butchered, her hands flew to her mouth. She didn't need to ask what happened, she already knew. I felt my son shaking, clutching at his hair like he was trying to piece himself back together, like if he held on tight enough, he could undo what had been done. But there was no undoing this. Karen had taken something from him, something deeper than just hair. She had taken his security, his comfort, his right to exist in his own skin without being violated. And she had done it without fear, without hesitation, because she believed, no, she knew, that no one would stop her. I had spent years arresting criminals, seeing the worst of humanity. But nothing in my time as a police officer had ever filled me with the kind of rage that burned through me now. This wasn't just about my son's hair. This was about power. Control. Karen had made it clear long before today that she saw Ethan as a problem, something that needed to be fixed. And when words and sneers weren't enough, she had acted. That's when I knew this wasn't the first time. I set Ethan down on the couch, my wife kneeling beside him, stroking what was left of his hair, whispering soft reassurances. But I didn't stay. I turned and walked straight to my home office, pulled up my computer, and started digging. If Karen thought she could get away with this, she was about to learn that she had picked the wrong family to cross. The first thing I found was footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera, a clip from months ago that I hadn't paid attention to at the time. Karen, standing across the street, staring at Ethan while he sat on the front steps running his fingers through his hair. Her expression was one of pure disgust, her lips curled, her eyes narrowed. Then she turned, shaking her head, muttering something under her breath before walking away. But that was just the beginning. I reached out to a friend at Ethan's school, someone who owed me a favor, and within an hour, I had the email records from the principal's office. There it was, in black and white. Karen had tried to bribe the principal to enforce a new grooming policy that required boys to have short, neatly trimmed hair. It's for the good of the community. We must uphold standards. The principal had refused, but Karen wasn't done. Through my contacts, I got access to the HOA's internal emails. What I found made my blood run cold. Karen had been proposing a neighborhood appearance code for months. She had written detailed complaints about unkempt children, repeatedly citing Ethan, without using his name, as a prime example of why such a rule was necessary. Our neighborhood prides itself on a clean and respectable image. Some families do not share these values. If we do not enforce a higher standard, we risk attracting undesirable elements. She wasn't just complaining. She was planning. And then came the worst part. I spoke to Tyler and Caleb, Ethan's best friends. Their faces turned uneasy when I asked if anyone else at school had ever said anything about Ethan's hair. Yeah, Caleb admitted, hesitating. It's weird. A few kids started making fun of it out of nowhere. Not a lot. But, some of them said stuff about how real men don't have long hair or how he looked like a girl. Who said it? I asked. Tyler shifted uncomfortably. Kids we don't even really talk to. One day, they started acting like Ethan was weird. We thought it was random. It wasn't random. Karen had planted the idea into other parents' heads. I went back through a local parents' Facebook group that my wife and I barely checked, something we used only for occasional school updates or neighborhood notices. Buried in old threads, months before the attack, were Karen's comments. "It's a shame some parents don't teach their boys how to present themselves properly. Not everyone belongs in a gated community like this. The right influences are important. We don't want our kids picking up bad habits." She had been trying to turn the neighborhood against Ethan for months. Whispering. Planting seeds. Setting him up for humiliation. And when the slow, steady attack didn't work fast enough, when Ethan didn't break on his own, she took matters into her own hands. I clenched my fists so tight my nails dug into my palms. My breathing was slow, controlled, but inside, I was seething. Karen thought she was untouchable. She thought she had the HOA's protection, the neighborhood's silence, and the fear of those who had watched her destroy people before. But she had never gone up against me. I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and reached for my phone. First, I called a lawyer. Then, I called the media. And finally, I called someone I never thought I'd reach out to, an old HOA board member who had quietly stepped down years ago. Because if Karen had been running this neighborhood like a dictator, that meant there were buried secrets, ones she never thought would resurface. She had spent years building her empire of fear. But now, I was going to burn it to the ground. The first sign that Karen wasn't going down without a fight came the next morning. A letter, hand-delivered by one of her HOA lackeys, was waiting on our doorstep. The envelope was thick, official-looking, with the HOA's embossed seal on the front. I already knew what it was before I even opened it. A warning. A threat. A desperate attempt to shut us up. Inside was a formal notice citing my family for public disturbances, a vague, sweeping claim that accused us of fostering community unrest and engaging in actions that may be considered slanderous against a respected HOA board member. The words were carefully chosen, veiled in legal jargon, but the message was clear. Karen and her cronies wanted us to back off, to fall in line like every other family she had steamrolled in the past. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't like the others. I wasn't afraid of her. I took the letter, walked straight to my car, and drove to the police station. By the time I got there, I wasn't just pressing charges against Karen, I was formally requesting an investigation into the HOA itself. Because this wasn't just about my son anymore. Karen had been doing this for years. By the time I returned home that afternoon, my phone was already blowing up. Calls. Emails. Texts from numbers I didn't recognize. Some from neighbors, whispering their support, cautiously telling me they had wanted to speak up against Karen for years but had been too afraid. Others? Not so friendly. HOA board members, ones I had barely interacted with before, suddenly reaching out with thinly disguised concern. "We believe this is all a big misunderstanding," one message read. "This community has always prided itself on respect and professionalism," said another. "Dragging this matter into legal territory will only hurt all parties involved." Then came the real kicker. One of the HOA board members, a smug, well-dressed man named Gregory Hale, actually showed up at my house, acting as if we were old friends. He smiled, shook my hand a little too firmly, and launched into his carefully rehearsed speech about how this was a private matter that should be handled internally. Internally. Meaning they wanted me to shut up and let them sweep it under the rug. That's when I realized just how deep this corruption ran. Karen wasn't just some overbearing neighbor with too much time on her hands, she was the face of something much bigger. The HOA wasn't just enabling her, they were protecting her. Covering for her. And if they were willing to go this far for one incident, how many others had they buried over the years? I met Gregory's gaze and gave him a slow, deliberate smile. "You know," I said, my voice calm, steady, "I think you're right. This does need to be handled properly." For a second, he looked relieved. Then I pulled out my phone, pressed play, and watched his face drain of color as his own voice filled the air. Because, while Gregory had been standing on my porch, pretending to play peacemaker, I had been recording every single word. And just a few minutes earlier, he had said something very, very interesting. "This is getting out of hand," he had muttered, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure no one was listening. Karen was just doing what needed to be done. We all agreed something had to be done about your son. She just took initiative. Took initiative. I let the words sink in. Let him hear them. Let him watch as the realization set in that he had just incriminated the entire HOA. Then I ended the recording, slipped my phone back into my pocket, and nodded toward the street. "You can go now, Gregory. I think we're done here." He left without another word. Less than an hour later, the real fallout began. A whistleblower stepped forward. A former HOA board member who had resigned years ago contacted me, claiming they had proof that Karen, and the rest of the HOA, had been covering up harassment, financial fraud, and illegal property violations for years. Within 2 days, I had access to documents that made my stomach turn. Lists of families Karen had targeted, single parents, elderly homeowners, immigrant families, all of them pushed out through a combination of excessive fines, fabricated violations, and social isolation. Emails showing deliberate cover-ups, vandalism complaints ignored, safety hazards dismissed, false reports filed against people Karen wanted gone. Financial records proving the HOA had been funneling money, community funds used for lavish dinners, vacations, and private club memberships for board members. I had everything I needed. I took every single document, every recorded conversation, every email thread, and I sent it straight to my lawyer, the police, and the local news. And just like that, the entire neighborhood erupted. The same people who had once whispered behind closed doors were now speaking out. The same neighbors who had been too afraid to stand up to Karen were now gathering in the streets, demanding justice. Karen's empire was crumbling, and for the first time in her life, she couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. She tried to retaliate, of course. She called a neighborhood meeting, desperate to regain control, desperate to spin the narrative in her favor. But it was too late. The meeting turned into a riot. People shouted her down. They demanded her resignation. They waved printed copies of her emails in the air, throwing them onto the table in front of her. "You targeted our children," someone screamed. "You drove families out of their homes. You stole from us, Karen. You stole from this entire community." And then came the final blow. A local news crew showed up, cameras rolling, capturing every second of her public disgrace. Karen stood there, stunned, shaking, completely unprepared for the fact that, for the first time in her life, she had lost. She opened her mouth, no doubt ready to spin some excuse, some desperate plea to shift the blame. But before she could speak, the front doors burst open. And the police walked in. The crowd fell silent. Karen turned, confusion flickering across her face, until she saw me standing just behind the officers, arms crossed, watching her with quiet satisfaction. One of the officers stepped forward, voice clear, firm. "Karen Dawson, you're under arrest." She let out a choked, strangled noise, her face contorting in disbelief as the handcuffs snapped around her wrists. And just like that, the queen of the HOA was officially dethroned. Karen had spent years believing she was untouchable. That her power was absolute, her influence unshakable. Even as the police officer read her rights, she didn't seem to fully comprehend what was happening. She jerked her arms, trying to pull free from the cuffs, her manicured nails digging into her palms, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. Her eyes darted across the room, searching for someone, anyone, to come to her defense. But no one moved. No one spoke. For the first time in her life, Karen Dawson was truly alone. "You can't do this," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is harassment. This is—" The officer tightened his grip on her arm, guiding her toward the door. "Ma'am, I suggest you remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." Karen's face twisted, an ugly mix of fury and disbelief, but it wasn't until she saw the cameras that the real panic set in. The flashing lights, the reporters shoving microphones forward, the neighbors filming with their phones, their faces unreadable. It was all being documented. For the first time, she was the one under scrutiny, the one whose every move was being judged. And then, through the crowd, she saw him. Charles Dawson. Her husband. He stood at the edge of the chaos, watching with an unreadable expression, his tailored suit immaculate as always, his posture straight, composed. Karen's breath hitched as their eyes met. She pulled against the officers one more time, desperate now, hopeful. He would fix this. He had to. "Charles," she cried. "Tell them this is a mistake. Tell them to stop." But Charles didn't move. He didn't even blink. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw the man standing beside him. A lawyer. His lawyer. A slow, cold realization crept into her chest, and suddenly, she wasn't fighting the cuffs anymore. Her body went rigid, the blood draining from her face. The lawyer stepped forward, adjusting his tie before speaking, his voice flat, professional, merciless. "Mrs. Dawson, I'm here on behalf of your husband." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle before delivering the final blow. "You've been served. Effective immediately, Charles Dawson has filed for divorce." The words hit her like a sledgehammer. Karen's lips parted, but no sound came out. She blinked, shaking her head slightly, as if she had misheard. Divorce? No. That wasn't possible. Charles had always stood by her. Even when she pushed boundaries, even when the HOA disputes got out of hand, he had never interfered. He had always cleaned up her messes. Always handled things behind the scenes. But now he was throwing her away. You can't be serious," she stammered. "You're leaving me? Now? After everything I've done for you?" Charles exhaled slowly, his face impassive, his voice almost detached. "You stopped being useful a long time ago, Karen." It was like watching something inside her shatter. Her breath quickened, her eyes darting wildly between him and the lawyer, then to the officers restraining her, then to the neighbors who had once feared her but now watched with quiet, bitter satisfaction. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, you can't do this. You can't just." But he already had. The officers guided her down the steps, and the moment her feet hit the pavement, the crowd erupted. Applause. Cheers. Relief. The same people who had once avoided her gaze now stood united, watching as she was led toward the waiting police car. Some laughed. Some clapped. One man actually raised a glass of wine, as if toasting to her downfall. Karen let out a strangled, furious cry. "You're all traitors," she shrieked. "You're all." The officer opened the back door of the squad car and shoved her inside. The door slammed shut. For years, Karen had wielded power through fear. She had ruined families, terrorized her neighbors, manipulated the HOA into becoming her personal enforcement squad. And for years, no one had dared to stop her. But now, the fear was gone. And Karen Dawson? She was just another criminal being driven away in cuffs. Her reign was over. But her suffering? That was only beginning. The neighborhood was different after Karen was gone. Lighter. Freer. The air no longer felt weighted with the silent tension of people too afraid to step out of line. The HOA, once Karen's personal kingdom, crumbled under the weight of the investigation. Board members resigned in disgrace. New leadership took over, not as enforcers, but as actual representatives of the community. The fines, the harassment, the ridiculous rules designed to punish people instead of protect them, it all disappeared. But for me, none of that mattered as much as Ethan. He had spent days after the attack avoiding mirrors, running his hands over the uneven remains of his once long hair with quiet devastation. It wasn't just the loss, it was the way it had been taken from him. Without his permission. Without his control. And no matter how many times we reassured him, no matter how much we reminded him that Karen had lost, the damage still lingered. She had wanted to make him feel small. To make him feel like he didn't belong. So we gave him his power back. We took him to the best hairstylist in the city, not just for a fix, but to give him a choice. For the first time since that awful day, Ethan got to decide what happened to his own hair. He thought about it for a long time, staring at himself in the mirror, fingers tracing the jagged edges left behind by Karen's cruelty. Then, finally, he smiled, a real, genuine smile, and told the stylist what he wanted. An hour later, he turned around in the chair, looking at his reflection, and I saw my son stand taller. He had chosen a bold, sharp cut, sleek and precise, with a lightning bolt design shaved into the side. It was his choice, his expression, his way of saying he wasn't broken. The stylist grinned at him and said, "Hair grows back, kid. But confidence? That's forever." And in that moment, I knew, Karen hadn't won. The next day, his friends came over. Tyler, Caleb, Mason, all of them. They stood on our porch, kicking at the ground, hands stuffed in their pockets in that awkward teenage way, but their eyes lit up when they saw him. "Dude," Tyler said, letting out a low whistle. "That's badass." Caleb nodded. "Way cooler than before. You actually look kinda dangerous now." Ethan hesitated for half a second, then grinned. A real, weight lifting off his shoulders kind of grin. "Yeah," he muttered, running a hand over his new cut. "I think so too." And just like that, it was over. Karen had tried to strip him of his dignity. She had tried to make him feel powerless. But in the end, she only proved that he was stronger than she ever was. So here's my question to you. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or a Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.